Good morning, everyone. As you come in and settle in to our Zoom today, I invite you all to introduce yourselves using the chat while we wait for everyone to join us this afternoon. And we'll get started in just a little bit. As you may notice, this is a meeting, so you are on video. We totally welcome you to keep your video on too as you settle in and join us, and we wait for everyone to join. And we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. Wonderful. I'm seeing some introductions. We have Willie Lubka from Buen Vecino. Hi, Willie. We also have Alex Espinoza from Corazon del Pueblo, Social Justice Fund for Ventura County, Michael Teasdale, too. Really, really pleased to see just the variety of individuals joining us across Santa Barbara and Ventura County. So thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. As you settle in, I also want to make you all aware that we are recording this meeting right now. So if you don't really want to be recorded, we totally respect that. Please feel free. You can turn your video off on the left-hand side of your monitor, but you can still contribute and engage with the dialogue in chat form or using your audio as well. All right. I think, Lena, we can go ahead and get started.
Hello. Hola. This is a bilingual message and will be repeated in English. Hola, mi nombre es Carla Martens y estoy con Lena Morán. Este es un mensaje bilingüe que será repetido en inglés. Somos de la compañía Uniendo Voces y vamos a interpretar el taller de hoy, entre inglés y español. Un ambiente bilingüe virtual exitoso depende de todos y todas, no solamente de los y las intérpretes. Pueden ayudar teniendo en cuenta algunos puntos. Hablen claramente para asegurar que los podamos escuchar. Hablen a un ritmo moderado y tengan cuidado de no hablar demasiado rápido, especialmente si están leyendo, para que podamos alcanzar a interpretar todo. Solamente debe hablar una persona a la vez para que no tengamos que decidir a quién interpretar. Hablen en el idioma en el que se sientan más cómodos y cómodas. Pedimos que las personas bilingües no cambien de un idioma a otro entre frases, debido a las limitaciones de la tecnología con la que contamos. En un momento, el anfitrión activará la función de interpretación en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. Podrán seleccionar el idioma en el que desean escuchar el taller, inglés o español. Si están en un teléfono o tableta, podrán seleccionar en el menú de 3 puntos el idioma en el que desean escuchar la interpretación. Si está teniendo algún problema con su conexión o con la interpretación, mande un mensaje por la ventana del chat al anfitrión para resolver el problema. Muchas gracias.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lena Moran. I'm here with my partner, Carla Martins. We are from Bridging Voices, and we will be the interpreters for the event today. We will be providing simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish. A successful virtual bilingual environment depends on all of us, not just the interpreters. So we'd like you to keep a few things in mind. First, please speak clearly so we can hear you. Speak at a moderate pace, and please be careful not to speak too fast, especially if you are reading. So we can keep up. We definitely don't want anybody to miss anything. Only one person should speak at a time, so we don't have to choose who to interpret for. For our bilingual participants, please feel free to speak in either English or Spanish as you feel more comfortable. Just please don't change your language in the middle of the sentence due to the limitations of the technology we're working with. In a moment, the host will turn on the interpretation feature. At the bottom right part of your screen, you'll be able to select the language that you'd like to hear the presentation, either English or Spanish. And if you are joining us on a phone or a tablet through the app, you will find a 3-dot menu once the feature is turned on, and that's how you'll find the language interpretation. If you're having any trouble with that feature, please send a message through the host, through the chat, and so the issue can be resolved. Thank you.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Take a Stance, Nonprofit Civic Engagement in the Ballot Box. My name is Jenny Lynn Tumalad, and I am the Program Specialist here at the Center for Nonprofit Leadership. This event is extra special because not only are we able to make space to discuss these really timely topics, but we had the great opportunity to partner with our friends at the Fund for Santa Barbara to put this together for you all today. I was able to connect with my thought partner in this program, Stanley Sankoff, through a group of regional Ventura and Santa Barbara County capacity builders, and I'm so grateful I told the group my early ideas in producing an event about nonprofits' role in the election. Because my plea got me connected to Stanley, who helped make this event turn from a small seed into a fully blossomed garden, like cherry tomato level garden. So thank you so much for helping me bring this event to life, Stanley. Before I hand it over to Stanley, I want to bring your attention to a couple logistics for our time together today. Some main functions you'll be using on Zoom today are your video, your audio, and your chat box. And if you're feeling a little bit silly, of course, you can also use your reactions by clicking the button to your bottom right. The chat box is on the right side of your window. Many of you are already using it today, and it allows you to contribute questions or comments about today's workshop without having to use your audio. You can also use it to contact someone privately using the drop-down menu and clicking their names. And in case you run into any issues with your tech or you want to ask something privately, please feel free to chat me, Jenny Lynn Tumalad, in the chat box. As you all know and see, we are hosting a meeting today, so you have the ability to have your audio and your video on. And just so you're all aware, I said this in the earlier half of our time together, we're going to be recording, and we are currently recording this workshop. So if you don't feel comfortable having your video recorded, please feel free to turn your video off by pressing the left-hand side button at the bottom of your screen. Now again, if you have any issues or get kicked off of this Zoom for some reason, please contact me. You can chat me, Jenny Lynn Tumalad, in the chat box, or text me, as I will be putting my cell phone in the chat box in case anything happens. So without further ado, here's Stanley, who will be sharing a bit more about what you're in for today.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much, Jenny. My name is Stanley Sankoff, he, him pronouns, and I have the privilege to be on staff at the Fund for Santa Barbara, community foundation advancing progressive change by strengthening movements. Over the past 5 years, I have worn a number of different hats and currently lead our capacity building efforts, which include guiding our organization through our elections, endorsements, and nonprofit lobbying and advocacy resources. I want to just share my gratitude to the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, Dina's role in cultivating connection within our regional sector, particularly when it was most needed as the pandemic started most recently, has been incredibly helpful and was really where Jenny and I got to think of this important topic. And of course to my co-conspirator, Jenny, who I've had the pleasure to work with on co-hosting this effort, who came up with the idea and has done a terrific, thoughtful and effective job in bringing this forward. So I'm really excited to be here with you all. And we have a really great agenda for the day. I'm really excited to introduce you all to Geoff Green and Nona Randois, whose wealth of experience and insight into these topics are so well suited. Geoff Green is the perfect person to talk to us about why our nonprofit sector should engage in elections and lobbying and advocacy more generally. I think he's a self-identified political junkie and is currently the CEO of the Santa Barbara City College Foundation, where he helped create the Student Promise for local high school students to have their expenses covered for the first 2 years. Geoff and I met when he was the executive director at the Fund for Santa Barbara, where he built out much of the process and culture I'll be speaking on later on this topic. Geoff is somebody who's incredibly effective at making important connections in various spaces, and certainly between nonprofits and the electoral and legislative space. He's done that certainly locally by holding a number of different hats that he wears, and certainly statewide with his role as a board member and former chair of the California Association of Nonprofits, a group which does a great job of advocating for and helping empower the state's nonprofit sector. And our second speaker, Nona Randois, is my go-to person when I have any sort of questions about what nonprofits can and can't do when it comes to lobbying and advocacy. She leads the Alliance for Justice Bolder Advocacy work in California, and they provide expert training, resources, and technical assistance to support nonprofits and foundations conducting advocacy in our state. She's a thought leader who directs advocacy efforts to protect nonprofit advocacy rights and builds relationships with key partners. And we've had the pleasure to host Nona for a number of years at the fund, and refer to her very regularly, and certainly these months. So with that, we will start off with Geoff sharing a bit about why nonprofits should engage in civic engagement, including the election. And then we'll hand it off to Nona, who will talk more about what you can and can't do. And then we'll go into our breakout rooms where we will take a deeper dive into those first two topics, and where I will be hosting a discussion on kind of the internal policies and processes that nonprofits can really explore and be mindful of. And then we'll wrap up our day by rejoining this main room and call it a day. So I will go ahead and welcome Geoff Green, and thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Stanley, and thank you all for being here. This is something that I am, I think I was earlier identified as a self-identified political junkie, and that's all truth, #true. And so I really want to thank Jenny Lynn and Stanley for leading the charge to do this. I don't honestly think there are, you can never do this too much, especially within our sector, just to remind and uplift the notion that we really are political leaders as well as folks who do good work in our communities. So I think it's important to talk about this, and I'm always excited for an invitation to do so. So thank you all for being here. This morning, what I think I'll do before I hand it off to Nona is sort of set up the why part of the equation, maybe a little bit of the how before Nona can share some of what that landscape looks like and what we all need to know as we go forward. And I've certainly leaned on Nona's expertise and the expertise of AFJ for really decades now. But let me take the step back and really start us off with the why, because I think this is something that our sector tends not to recognize the full value of in a typical day, and there are great examples of exceptions to that rule. But in many cases, our nonprofit sector is either unaware or averse, or in some cases just outright hostile to engaging in this work. And there's a lot of reasons for that. On the other hand, we can point to some incredibly successful examples of where political engagement by the nonprofit sector has really changed. I mean, it sounds trite, but I think change the world is the right way to frame that. One of the questions I tend to start with, I mean, if we think about the movements and the work that we're all passionate about, I would challenge anyone to name a significant movement in the United States in the last century that was not completely or at least partly led by the nonprofit sector and the leadership therein. So I think it's important to note that that's real and there's a lot of opportunity there. So let me frame it a few different ways to start off. And the first thing I want to talk about is really expertise. And I mean that in the sense that the nonprofit sector holds, nourishes, creates an incredible variety of expertise in real world situations. We're often the ones on the ground doing the work. We are the volunteers and the staff members and the board members who are most closely in touch with the communities that we serve. And if you want to really think about what it means to be a nation, or, I mean, I realize we're having this conversation on the day of the first presidential debate for this upcoming cycle. We are just, weeks, but really, let's just say days away from a major election at all levels, not just our national election, but our regional and statewide issues. And if we want to be a people that are truly of, by, and for the folks in our communities, the nonprofit sector taking the lead, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to ensure that be true. The expertise we have really can't be replicated or rivaled, and you can think of any issue you want. Think of housing and homelessness, think of environment, think of racial justice, think of child welfare, think of just about anything, and the nonprofit sector immediately offers a multitude of solutions, resources, and I really do believe that's where some of the most important leadership comes from in our communities. So I would say we need to own.
Geoff, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have a request to maybe slow down just slightly, please.
I told you this would happen, and I'm just happy that it happened in the first 3 minutes. So thank you. I will do that to our interpreters. Thank you so much for what you're doing. I will try not to make your lives difficult. So I think if we wanted to be effective, the first step is really to own that expertise. And that means, sometimes we have a bit of a crisis of confidence in our sector, and we're folks that do good work and we're always responding, but we, I think, need to own that leadership in a new way at times, and certainly to be relevant and effective in the political sphere. That's a big part of it. The second thing I wanted to highlight is a role that we have, that we've earned as the nonprofit sector over time, and that's being trusted. And time again, if you ask people, who do you trust to weigh in on a particular issue? Who do you believe truly has your best interests at heart? Who do you go to for good advice, information, or support? It's the nonprofit sector that often comes to mind. I'm going to screen share something right now. This is a piece of the work that I've had the privilege of doing over the years, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm noticing that one of my colleagues, Lucy, is on the call right now, Lucy Salcedo-Carter, who is our advocacy director for the statewide organization, the California Association of Nonprofits. But here's a simple slide. This is pulled out of a report called Causes Count. It was first done a few years ago. It was updated just last year. And this is a survey question. It was done in 2018 and 2019. And the survey simply asked people to rate their overall level of confidence in California's nonprofit sector. And it was 3 areas that they specifically asked. It was quality, who provides quality services? So that's the first bar graph you see on the left, where the nonprofit sector in gold hits the top at 87%. So we are trusted more than any other sector to do that. The second is, who do you trust to act on the public's behalf? That's the middle bar graph. And you can see there the steepest differential. The nonprofit sector is up at 84%, as opposed to, and by the way, the other two, if you look at the key, we're looking at California state government in gray, lighter gray, U.S. federal government in a darker gray, and the for-profit sector in California in green. And then the third question was, who spends money wisely? And again, and this is a place where we often feel, I think, attacked at times, or the bad examples that hit the media become the talking point. But in fact, even more than the for-profit or any governmental sector, people trust us to spend money wisely. So this is a really important boost to confidence above anything, just to remind us that we are trusted and we have the opportunity to harness that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. The third is that our perspective really centers on the public good. And that is something that is in itself powerful. And I think it's useful when we get into policy work, because I think of it this way. Just imagine if our housing policy was created, the crafting of that policy was led by housing providers or homeless service agencies. So that was the leadership that was crafting what our housing policy should look like. Or, think about that in environmental terms. These are the areas where we tend to be reactive. And yet I think that we can use the fact that we're centered in the public good to lead those conversations. We're not centered around personal gain or wealth accumulation or political advantage. But here we are with all this expertise and the trust of our communities. And then the last piece, and I'll share a few more slides here, is really an argument for the fact that we are also not to be messed with. We are a significant force in our communities and a force for good at that. And I think that if you look at what our communities believe about us, and you combine it with this fact, which is that as an economic force, we're 15% of the state's gross product. We bring more than $40 billion with a B into California each year. We have over $750 billion in annual revenue. So you can see here, we're a massive part of our economic sector. So we're not just an add-on or nice to have. We're actually core to the functioning of our communities. And then on the employment side, one of every 14 Californians works at a not-for-profit organization. We're the third largest, if you look at just wages of our key industries in our state, and we're the fourth largest by sheer number of jobs. So that's a big part of what we all do in our economic sector. We're also more reflective of our community than other sectors. We're more diverse by race and gender compared to other parts of the workforce. So there's a lot here, and again, I'll invite you to read this report. It's about 72 pages long, if I remember correctly, but there's a lot of good data in here, and I think we need to, again, just own that role. So let me just hit for a minute on some of the reasons that we don't do this. So I think it's important to note that there are real barriers for many folks about why we don't engage around political work. One is that we're not clear on the rules, and there's a lot of people that are just afraid to step foot in this realm because they're not clear on what is and what is not allowed. Nona is going to cover this in great detail, so I won't spend some time on this, but I just want to flag that that's one of the things. The fact is there are rules. We do need to know them. We've got to do our homework, but there's a lot of room for political advocacy and political engagement within those rules. And I would argue that we're not only allowed to, but I would say that the laws are written in such a way that we're really encouraged to be politically engaged. And that's my constant refrain. I think the second one is that we've been miseducated, oftentimes unintentionally, but sometimes quite intentionally, about our opportunity for political engagement. The nonprofits cannot be political refrain, which we've all heard too many times, is false. It's straight up false. It is wrong. It is not true. It has never been true. What we can't do is be partisan. That's the difference. So for a 501c3, which is a tax status, not a business model, we'll talk about that too. For a 501c3, you cannot be partisan. You cannot engage in candidate work and you cannot engage in party work. That is the end of the list. Everything else around policy, ballot measures, advocating to legislatures, that is all absolutely within our realm. And I think that's the piece that we can always step up further to. I think the other are some more human issues. We tend to be conflict averse in many cases. And that's not just people, individuals that are more conflict averse than others. But for many organizations, this is baked into the DNA of how we do our work. And there's some good reasons for that. We're trying to harness the goodwill of donors and volunteers, and of course our frontline staff members. And one of the ways to make sure everybody's on the team and playing well together is to not get into areas where there might be a debate or a disagreement. So I don't think that's due to ill will. But I do think we need to find ways to sort of rediscover that art of civic engagement, which I think we can all agree is I won't call it lost. It's not lost yet, but it's harder and harder in this particular moment in our country to do it. And I think this is where the cultural preparation in an organization is so critical. We have to build a norm around this. We have to build a culture that prioritizes it, and we have to build systems to help us through it. And this is what Stanley's going to share in the breakout session. So we'll talk a lot more about that later. In many cases, we are problem solvers, and we tend to be reactive problem solvers. And that's a beauty of our sector, but it's also a hindrance at times. Because that's an easy thing for us to do. We understand, we know how to identify the problem, especially when we're really of a community and we're identifying, I know this, I've lived it, I can help, and that's why people trust us. But there's a very popular saying, which I love to repeat, and I will at least twice today, and that's if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's the truth of our political world. And that's true around budgets. We all know that's true around budgets, but it's true around other kinds of policy as well. So we have to be at the table making policy, preferably leading policy making. Otherwise, we're constantly reacting, solving problems, plugging holes, working at the margins. And as valuable as that is, we can't change the big picture structural challenges that we have by only doing that. And the last is really that we're stretched thin. A lot of us, a lot of organizations don't venture into this work simply because they feel completely overwhelmed. They're stretching resources and time. They're exhausted by the work that they're living every day while trying to help others through it. And so it's easy to say, look, I just don't have the capacity to do this. That's our favorite code word, isn't it? Capacity. But the problem is only being reactive relegates us to that margin work. And it relegates us to always fixing where the hole is, where the biggest challenge is, and never getting to the root cause. And this is part of my love of the work at the Fund for Santa Barbara and our other progressive community-led activist foundations, is that it was always grassroots work trying to look at the root causes of why something happened. So it's the difference between questioning why people are homeless and simply providing a shelter for a night. So we'll look at the policy. It's about why are people hungry versus offering to feed someone for a day or a week or a month. So this is the hard work, and this is where policy is always part of it, policy and budget. So I think those are probably the biggest challenges that we face. And so let's talk for a little bit about how we could actually go into this work. And I think this is important for every organization, and I'm noticing some of the faces and friends on today's call. Some people are many decades into advocacy work, and I'm grateful for you for that. And others are probably very brand new to this. So the first thing I would offer is just start small, and starting small is absolutely fine. In fact, it's probably the best way to do it. And by small, I don't mean think small, I mean think big. But as far as take actions that are small and within your capacity at the moment, you can start to shift the culture of an organization in many different ways. And oftentimes it only takes one person. And it doesn't have to be the leader. It doesn't have to be the executive director or the CEO. It doesn't have to be the board president. It can be any number of folks who are doing the work. It can be volunteers. It can be frontline staff. It can be anyone to ask the question. I find that question asking is sometimes the best way. So, why is that? Or have we ever considered? Or did you notice that? Or whatever it may be, just start to bring those conversations about policy into the room. And I think the discussion of how one's work is connected to policy is a great place to start, because it doesn't challenge as much as what has to come later. It simply says, we work on this issue. How is that affected by the thing I heard on the news yesterday? Or how is that affected by that hearing that we saw at City Council? Or what about Proposition XYZ? How does that connect to our work? So getting to connect what you do, and by all means, and I don't know if anyone would challenge this notion, but everything we do is connected to policy. I don't think there is actually an exception to that rule. Every social service agency, it's all connected to policy. So I think the next thing you could do beyond just asking the questions and trying to make the argument of connecting to policy is start to build relationships. And so much of this work is relationship-based, and so much of politics is relationship-based. And I think we know this instinctively, but it doesn't always show up. It's not something that we consciously talk about. We are loved organizations doing good work on the ground. Therefore, it should be a pretty easy invitation to ask policymakers to join us. Come to our events, buy a ticket, sponsor, comp them if you have to, give them the mic if you can afford to. Let your policymakers at all levels engage in your work, see your work, be part of your work, build that relationship. Because I think, and by the way, do that with folks you disagree with as well. So it doesn't, I mean, start with your allies. That's often the easiest place to start. But there's plenty of folks that are not obviously on your team who you never know when that relationship will be important. And the relationship doesn't have to be that they're always supportive of where you'd want to go. But it should be that they're aware of what you're doing, how you're doing it. And there may be that moment where, those strange bedfellows moments where because of the issue, you have out alliances that are unexpected. That helps you do the next thing, which is really position yourself to be the go-to, the experts. And that's when it's worked, is when you get the call. You're not calling them, you're getting the call from the commissioner, from the supervisor, from the council member, from the mayor, from the senator, from the assembly person, whatever it may be. And they're saying, hey, I need some more information on this. Or do you have a report about? Or could you come speak to my committee about? That's how you know you've really made it into the door. And those are the things that are worth building toward, because that positioning gives you that street cred in a way where the next step is you are at the table making policy. You're not just responding. I think that to be good at both data and storytelling is one of the keys to that. So you have to study the data, use the charts. I'm a graph and chart guy. I always admit it, always have. I love my charts and graphs. But someone said to me just the other day, move hearts with arts, not charts. And I thought, it's cute. But it's true. Like there's ways to tell stories, whether it be through the arts or what have you, that also are powerful, and sometimes more powerful to the right audience. So be able to pivot between those two. Be a good ally and a good partner. I'd say do that. I mean, that's a big one. You want to be able to advocate from a we're all in this together perspective. So it's not just about you or your organization or even your issue, but it's about building those alliances and cross-sector relationships that help. The next is really to build your own internal policies and budgets and governance systems around the notion that you should be engaged in this work. And this, again, is where Stanley will do some work with everybody in the breakout. And that's when you've normalized it internally. And then, bring your donors along, but you have to be ready to lose some. And this is the hardest part. This, I think, is another reason that some folks shy away from political engagement, is because there's a what if somebody stops giving. And I don't want to pretend that you can bring everybody along, because you can't. That said, in my experience, and almost every study or story I'm aware of, it's always worth the trade-off. You may lose a few folks, but if you're clear and you've been bringing people along, you don't lose many, and sometimes you don't lose anybody. You've made the case. They love what you do, and you've helped them connect that to the policy work. That's the key. So I would say that's worth kind of preparing for, but don't let funders constrain your work. And that's a foundation, that's a donor, that's a government grant. There are some big challenges in this space, and it's not always possible to completely avoid those constraints. But if you go into it assuming that you are as free as you've ever been to do the best work as you define it, that is how I think most successful advocacy organizations position themselves. And then finally, and I'll end with some examples here. Use your social capital in service of your cause. Again, I think I've beat on this enough today. You're trusted, you're powerful, you are loved and supported. So you can turn that into political power too. So it doesn't just have to be warm and fuzzy. You can say, great, you all believe in this. If you all support our work, this is what needs to happen for that to change. And that can shock some folks because they're not used to it. But you have the social capital, the political capital to do it. So you can mobilize voters. You can ask people to vote in service of whatever they believe in that's connected to your organization. And of course, you can go well beyond that. You can host candidate forums and issue report cards and start to really do even more work. And I'll leave it to Nona to talk about some of those. Some examples, and again, I know Cal Nonprofits I've invoked twice, and Lucy's on the call, but I will say, vote with your mission is a great example of that. The vote with your mission concept is simply an encouragement of all nonprofit staff, volunteers, and employees to commit to voting every election cycle, and to vote in service of the values of the organization that they work with or for. And that's actually a very simple thing to ask, and yet it has a huge effect. And I don't think we've come anywhere near harnessing the full force of that. Because voter turnout rates are so abysmal in general in our country, but also because people do separate in their minds their political work and their nonprofit work. And the more we can marry those together, I think the more powerful we can be. Sign on to, join coalitions. There's plenty of coalitions out there doing great work. And if you sign on to be part of them, I think that can be powerful. You can sign on to letters to legislators. There's been a lot of that this year. The network, various nonprofit networks, actually the National Council nonprofits, Cal nonprofits, certainly a lot of things around the CARES Act funding, social service agencies, human service agencies. There's been a lot of that work. And it's a great, to me, a very exciting moment to see that shift. Inviting policymakers to events, I've mentioned that. You can testify at hearings. You yourself can sit on commissions. I think it's important to put ourselves forward as candidates to be appointed to boards and commissions and be seen as people that can bring real knowledge to any policy conversation. I will share a couple things and then a couple notes, and I'll hand it off to Nona here. Let me just share this latest sort of measure. This also comes from the Causes Count report, and I think what it shows here is that we are, although I think we need to do more, the movement is in the right direction. We've got 71% of Californians that say that we are critical and important to society. Only 1% that says we're not. And here's how we've harnessed that. This is what people have said. 85% say we improve the quality of life, 78% that we stand for values, 60% that we reduce inequality. So you can see here that this is what we can harness for our political work and for our advocacy work. And this is how we've done it. Nonprofits actually lobby a lot through that coalition work, where they join. If they can't do it themselves, they harness the power of the collective whole. And 52% in this last report said that they belong to an association that actually works in coalition to lobby on policy. And then if you look on the right-hand side, this was simply a question in the last year: how often did your nonprofit engage in the following activities? You can see that 3/4 actually met with public officials or their staffs. And that staff is an important thing, by the way, especially as you get into higher and higher office, getting the relationships not just with the elected, but with the staff members that run the legislative or office operation. You can see there the rest. I won't read it out loud. You can see it on the screen, or you can read the report. But there's quite a bit that people already are doing, and I think that's a great thing. The last two notes I'll share, and I'll stop sharing my screen here, is that we need to understand a couple of things. One, the difference between advocacy and lobbying. What we do every day in many ways is in fact advocacy for our work. We're advocating for the importance of what we do, and there's actually a technical definition of how far you can go before it becomes lobbying. And lobbying is measured very specifically by the IRS and other authorities. So Nona will talk a bit about that. The second is the fact that in the end, if we don't do this work, we are, as I said earlier, relegated to the margins. We are only doing the cleanup, catch-up, reactive work. And as invaluable and important as that is, it only gets us so far. And we're not going to change the systems, and we're not going to solve the big problems structurally if we don't go a step further. I will put some numbers to that, and I will simply share this. In 2019, philanthropy, all private philanthropy in the United States amounted to approximately $400 billion. We've been hovering around that for about 3 years now. And regardless of what the COVID pandemic does or the 2017 tax breaks do, we're hovering around 400 billion with a B in private philanthropy. Public expenditure in the United States, according to the US Bureau of Economic Statistics in 2019, was $7.3 trillion. So you can do the math, but I'll do it for you. It's basically a 20-to-1 is what we're looking at. So no matter what we can do with private philanthropy, the public expenditure side, the side that is governed by policy, is 20 times as powerful. So if we want to change structures, if we want to solve problems at their root causes, we have to be politically engaged. And with that, I'll stop. But I'll only stop for a brief moment because I get to introduce Nona. And Nona is somebody, as Stanley said, who has been a huge support for us in this region. She, thank goodness, visits the Central Coast regularly. She is the California Director for Alliance for Justice, or AFJ's Bolder Advocacy work. She is she's done a few things before this. Let me tell you a few things she's done. She's been the directing attorney at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. She's also worked in the private sector with a firm whose name, and I love saying the names of legal firms, so I'm going to try it. Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom. I think of Monty Python skits when I do that. But she has worked in the private sector as well. Her law degree is from Georgetown, and she is the person that so many of us call when we need help with what's possible. So I'm very, very happy to hand it off to Nona Randois.
Thank you, Geoff, for that wonderful introduction and for all of the things that you shared. I am getting a message telling me that the host has disabled screen sharing. So maybe Jenny Lynn or Dina can help me so that I'll be able to share my screen here.
I'll take care of it right now.
In the meantime, all right, let me try again. Still getting, oh, there we go. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Once again, my name is Nona Randois. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the California Director for the Alliance for Justice's Bolder Advocacy Program in California. I'm an attorney who's here to encourage you to participate in advocacy activities as a nonprofit organization. The Bolder Advocacy Program of Alliance for Justice is part of a national organization, Alliance for Justice, headquartered in D.C. We have offices in Northern California and Southern California. I'm working on that Central Coast office. You know, as many times as I can be there is a good thing. So we also have offices in Texas, and our real mission is, as Stanley mentioned, to support nonprofits and the foundations that fund them in being bold in their advocacy work and increasing their engagement in advocacy work. And so I'm an attorney, as Geoff mentioned, and I always have to say I'm not your attorney. We don't give anyone legal advice, but we do lots of training and technical assistance. So one of the things I want you to know is that I couldn't possibly talk fast enough, even if it weren't for the interpretation, to share all the details of the rules that govern what we're doing. So I want to make sure that you know that not only do you have materials in the resource drive, but you also have access to our hotline, where we have a staff of attorneys from around the country who answer questions to help get you to the activity that you want to do. And that is the information that you see on your screen right now, which is advocacy@asj.org. and the 866 number, as well as the information in Spanish there for Sarah at asj.org, and the 415 phone number that you see on your screen. So Sarah speaks Spanish and is an attorney who can provide that support in Spanish. We have lots of materials on our website. We have a new podcast, so please check that out if you have any questions that you think we might be able to help you with. This piece just covered great. You know, we can, as nonprofits and as 501c3s, 501c3 public charities can advocate, can lobby, and can encourage people to participate in elections. And I like to tell people that they should do it. So just maybe didn't like tell people they should do it. I tell them that they should. So, and I think it is the mark of a really effective nonprofit that has this aspect to their work. So what is it that we can do? What can't we do? Here's a graphic that is basically aimed at explaining all the kinds of advocacy that 501c3 public charities can do and where they need to, be aware of restrictions. So first question is, are you acting on behalf of a 501c3 public charity? There's different kinds of nonprofits out there. Public charities are the biggest category within 501c3s. It's a certain kind of a 501c3. So the rules I'm talking about right now only apply to 501c3 public charities, which I think is most of our audience today. There's some rules that apply to more, but that's really kind of the ballpark that I'm in right now. So I hope you're there with me. And if that is the kind of nonprofit that you are, then there are really a lot of kinds of activities that you can engage in that I think of as advocacy. When I talk about advocacy, I'm thinking of a really broad field of activity that's about making change for a lot of people, right? A large number of people. So even though I've been an advocate for individual clients and my own kids and all of that kind of stuff, I'm thinking of advocacy as changing rules, policies, and systems that impact a large number of people. But it's not a specific legal definition, right? The only things where there's a specific legal definition that we need to be somewhat aware of are the concept of lobbying and the concept of partisan political activity. So I'm going to get to that for you. But before I go there, I want to say that everything you see on your screen that's in green is in green because you can do that all day, every day. As much funding as you can get to do that activity and as much time as you can dedicate to it, those are activities that you can do all day, every day as a public charity. And those are things that I think of as advocacy and that I know can have a major impact to make life better in your community and in our world. So we'll move on and we'll talk a tiny bit about the definition of lobbying, not much, and we'll talk about partisan political activity and how that relates to the election. So let's start with lobbying. When I'm talking about lobbying, I'm talking about trying to influence legislation. So those are things passed by legislatures, passed by U.S. Congress, passed by the state legislature, passed by city councils or county boards of supervisors. And it also includes ballot measures. And I know we're here today, and one of the things that we want to talk about is ballot measures and taking positions on ballot measures. So I wanted to make sure that it's clear that ballot measures, supporting and opposing ballot measures is considered lobbying. Now, what lobbying is not is supporting or opposing candidates for office, individuals whose names are on the ballot. So I'll talk about that soon. But before we get to that, just a little bit more about ballot measures and lobbying. So there may be some of you out there who've been doing this work and whose organizations have been doing this work, and you know about something called the 501H election, which I don't have time to go into detail about, but it's one of my favorite topics. So I'd love to talk about it. If you have questions in the breakout room, we can talk about it, or after. But if you have that method of measuring lobbying, then there's a very specific definition, which you can see referenced on the left-hand side of the screen. And there's a distinction between grassroots and direct lobbying. And in that case, ballot measures count as direct lobbying, which is great because it's an area where public charities have more ability to spend resources on lobbying. So what I want all of you to understand about lobbying is that 501c3 public charities can lobby, have a right to lobby, including supporting and opposing ballot measures. And to be able to do that, to exercise your right, you have to do three things. One is you have to stay within your IRS lobbying limit. So there's an allotment, there's a certain amount that you're allowed to spend and do to support, to lobby every fiscal year. What that limit is going to vary a lot depending on who you are, what your budget is, and a number of other things. So I can't sum it up easily right now. But I can tell you that you do have a lobbying limit. If you have questions about that, hopefully we can address them in the breakout room. But you need to stay within that lobbying limit. I like to think of it as an allotment. Really very generous in many cases, and in most cases it's going to be much more than you think that you can do once you actually go through the analysis and look at it for your organization. Second thing you need to do as a public charity to be able to lobby is track and report all of your lobbying to the IRS. It's on your 990. It's Schedule C. There's a question in the 990 or the 990EZ. You say yes, you fill out Schedule C. It's a report. We can do it. We do reports. We're so good at doing reports. This is something that we can do. And I can, myself and my team are happy to talk you through what needs to go into that report. But it does need to be reported to the IRS to make sure it stays within the lobbying limit. And the third thing we need to do is we need to use funds that don't say you can't use this money for lobbying. Generally speaking, of course, government funds are restricted. Private foundation funds really vary, and we do a lot of work with private foundations to encourage them to give you general support grants and other kinds of flexible funds that can be used for lobbying. So that's another aspect of our work, and happy to have conversations about whether or not certain funds are restricted or what that means, what does my grant agreement mean, things like that. So those are some things that we provide technical assistance about. Okay, that is the IRS framework for lobbying. And specifically relevant today because of ballot measures. So we can support ballot measures as long as we stay within our limit. And we can't support or oppose candidates, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but I want to say just a couple more words about ballot measure rules in the state of California. California thinks of ballot measures as a campaign activity, like supporting and opposing candidates. So they think of it differently than the IRS. There are no limits to how much anyone can do to support or oppose ballot measures under state law, but there are some triggers for reporting. Generally speaking, these are for high levels of activity, generally speaking, okay? So one thing is, if you're going to be diving in, doing significant work on ballot measures, you want to make sure you already have a process in place for measuring and reporting your lobbying to the IRS. That's a good first step. Second thing is you want to know whether you are coordinating, cooperating, communicating with a ballot measure committee, which is usually a good thing. It sounds kind of like a bad thing for a variety of reasons. Usually a very good thing that helps you have to do less reporting. So if you're getting materials from the Schools and Communities First campaign and you're sharing those out, you're probably coordinating with them in a way that makes your reporting responsibilities less and easier. Third thing you want to keep in mind, are you raising money into your organization that's earmarked to support or oppose ballot measures? Is there a donor out there, including a foundation, who thinks that you are spending a certain grant or certain contribution, donation on ballot measures, because that has a lot of reporting that goes along with it. So generally speaking, I don't recommend doing that unless you already know the rules, you have a campaign treasurer, you've formed a committee, you're ready to go, right? That's kind of an advanced topic right there. So don't just walk into that one of asking people for money earmarked for ballot measures. If you happen to have non-donor funds, it can be helpful for ballot measure work. Not many of us have it, but it would include rent, royalties, earned income. That kind of funding is treated differently under campaign finance law, and it might make your reporting easier if you have access to that kind of funding. Okay, so I don't even want to read this slide. This is kind of for you to look at later. It's for the recording, right? You may have state reporting requirements if any one staffer on your staff is spending more than 10% of their time in any calendar month on ballot measure work. If everyone is spending less than 10% of their time, then that's kind of a freebie. So that's a good thing to know and to take advantage of. I mentioned the second bullet point already. If you're raising funds into your organization and a donor would believe that that's to support or oppose a ballot measure, that is going to have some reporting associated with it. If you're spending more than $1,000 on printing, advertising, etc., especially if you are not coordinating with a ballot measure committee, you could have some reporting requirements. Usually the thresholds are higher than that as long as you're coordinating with a ballot measure committee, and that would be like a $10,000 threshold for reporting. So if you have questions about any of this, I would love to talk about it in the breakout room. I have a few more minutes to give a high-level overview of other kinds of election activity that we are allowed to be doing and that we need to be doing so badly this year. So as Geoff mentioned, as I mentioned at the top, 501c3s have to be nonpartisan. And what the heck does that mean? Because the IRS talks about it, and I think everybody thinks that it means something different. I think in our sector we all use this term in different ways. But I want you to understand what the actual rule is so that you know what you can do. And nonpartisan really sounds like it's kind of about political parties, but it's what the actual rule is we cannot support or oppose any candidate running for public office, whether or not they're affiliated with a political party. Okay, so it's going to be any elected public office, whether it's considered a partisan office or not. It could be sheriff, it could be a judicial election, it could be a city council election, school board. Obviously we're very aware of the presidential election, and Geoff mentioned the debate tonight. But this prohibition goes from the national elections to the local elections. Actually, probably international elections as well. But one thing I would be remiss in not sharing with you, because my organization is very focused on the importance of the federal judicial branch in terms of policy, is that 501c3 public charities can support and oppose nominees who are confirmed by the legislature. So as you are all, at least the political junkies out there are well aware, the Senate confirms, Supreme Court nominees, for example. And there's many other examples, both at the state and local level, as well as the federal level. That means it's not in the framework of an elected office that we can not weigh in on. We can weigh in because it's a legislative vote. And so it may count as lobbying, you know, if we're asking our senators to, you know, oppose the nominee, and but that is something that we can do, right? So just wanted to put that in there. We actually have a number of resources about this and a podcast about it as well if you're interested to learn more. So we can, as I've mentioned, support or oppose ballot measures, but when we're doing that, we have to make sure that we're not at the same time supporting or opposing candidates. So we can have, you know, I have the example here, the fund, they have their list of ballot measures that they support, that they oppose, but we wouldn't want to be standing on the stage at this Bernie rally, right? That really looks like a support or oppose for support for a candidate for office, I'm sorry. So we would want to make sure that we're not aligning ourselves with candidates at the same time as we're doing any ballot measure work. Everything we're doing is digital these days almost, and so all these rules apply to digital communications and social media as well. So if you do communications for your org, it's good to be aware of these rules. So there are things that we can do. Issue advocacy, candidate education, helping candidates understand where we stand on issues, right? Voter education, making sure that folks know how to vote, where to vote, what is on the ballot. Voter outreach, registering voters, getting out the vote, protecting the right to vote, and supporting and opposing ballot measures. These are all things that are permissible for 501c3s. Now, when we're doing this work, it is important to think about how our issue advocacy work could cross the line into looking like we're supporting or opposing a candidate. I think that you know, certainly the Supreme Court example might be something where it would be easy to see that there would be a way you could say, you know, I oppose this nominee or don't fill this seat, that would also support or oppose certain candidates for office, right? That's also true at the local level. So, you know, I found this graphic for keeping Oxnard affordable for working families, right? And this was public comments at an Oxnard City Council meeting. This is something that's permissible for a 501c3. It could be lobbying depending on what it's about, and I'm guessing that this probably was. I hope it was. But when you're talking about this issue, you don't want to be either criticizing or praising people who are on the city council, who are the mayor of Oxnard, that are up for election right now, in a way where you're talking about the election, right? We can engage in the issue advocacy, we can focus on the public policy issue, but we shouldn't be saying, because you didn't do what we want you to do, we oppose you in this election, or voters are going to vote against you because you didn't take this step, right? Or the opposite, you know, this is our champion, we love this person, and so make sure you get out and vote for them in November because they really did the right thing by supporting a cap on rent increases, right? So have to be careful when you're doing that issue advocacy that you're not crossing over into supporting or opposing candidates for office. We can go through lots of examples in the breakout group about that, but you should be thinking about why you're communicating now and to a certain audience, and make sure that it's not really about the election. This is something we'll talk more in a breakout group, and it will be relevant to things like if anyone's live tweeting the debate tonight, I would encourage you to think through some of these factors for how we make sure that we're not supporting or opposing candidates in doing that. We have the ability to do work in our individual capacities, not on the time of our 501c3s, and that should be separate from our work time. And as organizations and as people affiliated with 501c3s, we should do our best to really make it clear what hat we're wearing, and so that people understand and that we're not using the assets of our 501c3 to do any kind of individual political activity, which I hope you're all doing as well. So, in summation, and if you want to learn more, please join the breakout group. 501c3s can lobby and support and oppose ballot measures. They have to stay within their lobbying limit and report their lobbying. Support for ballot measures counts as lobbying, or opposing ballot measures also counts as lobbying. Nonprofits who raise money, even just a little bit, into their organization, or nonprofits who spend money, even just a little bit, without coordinating with any other ballot measure committee, are likely to have some kind of state reporting responsibilities. If you're just spending money that it was not earmarked, that you happen to have available, you're going to have to spend a lot more money to need to worry about ballot measure reporting requirements in the state. And just to clarify, money includes staff time. So sometimes we forget that when time is money and that our time is valuable, and that's something that the voters in our state care about. We should make sure that our issue advocacy doesn't cross over into supporting our opposing candidates. Be clear on what hat you're wearing, and come to the breakout session to learn more, or contact us on our hotline to learn more.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much, Geoff and Nona. That was so much really, really important information. I saw that there were a few questions in the chat, but we're actually going to have all of you go into deeper dives with your breakout sessions now. So as you all may know, with your registration, you also selected your desired breakout session. So for the next approximately 40 minutes or so, you'll be going into a deeper dive with Geoff, Stanley, and Nona. If you're participating in either Stanley or Geoff's session on endorsement mechanics or considering the landscape, you'll be seeing a prompt to go to your breakout session shortly. It's going to pop up on your screen, and then you can accept, or it will just send you. If you're signed up for a deeper dive with Nona on the do's and don'ts for elections and advocacy, you'll be staying put in the main room. If you don't get a prompt and you were expecting one, please contact my colleague Dina Jensen in the chat box, and we'll make sure that you get to where you need to go, where you want to go. So now, during your time together, we invite you all to designate a couple key takeaways or next steps that you'd like to share with the group whenever we all regroup. So without further ado, we're going to administer the breakouts, and we are going to see you back at around 1:20 to share. So enjoy. See you in a little bit. All right. Looks like people are being sent off, and Nona, I believe we have about 20 people or so for our group, so we can wait another second in case someone wants to hop over.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for staying and for joining the deeper dive on some of the do's and don'ts for engaging in elections work. And so I see a few questions that have already been put into the chat, but maybe one of the things we could do to start is maybe there's someone here who wants to volunteer to sum up a couple key takeaways or next steps when we go back into our plenary session. Is there anyone that's brave enough or available to do that?
Don't speak up all at once.
I promise I won't make you say what the law is. If you have any questions about that, you can always just point to me. All right. Okay. Well, Okay, maybe you will, as we go on, maybe you will become more clear on what that might look like. I'll do another crunch on that later. So you think about that. Just think about that. Are there folks who have questions that have not put those questions into the chat? Okay, there are folks. Great. I'm going to put you all in gallery view so I can see you a little bit better.
At this moment, like we definitely encourage you to be on screen too and share this dialogue and space with Nona as well. Willie and Kate, I know you both had put some questions in the chat box. You want to share your questions with Nona right now?
Okay. I actually emailed one before.
Yes, you did. I'm happy to say it for you if you'd like.
I don't mind. So, and then I had one in the chat. So we work very closely in the community with a number of grassroots organizations that are amazing, but not 501c3s. They might just be grassroots organizations with no formal incorporation, or they might be something else. And we work really closely with them. We have great relationships. Those partnerships are super important to us. But they're not constrained by being 501c3s from endorsing candidates and engaging in partisan activities. So we have to be careful about how we partner with them on things. And my question is, let's say there's going to be an event, and it's going to be co-sponsored by 3 or 4 organizations. And the event itself is not partisan or candidate focused, but we want to be one of the co-sponsoring organizations and have our logo and our cooperation aligned with these other groups on an event or a campaign. And they are going ahead and endorsing candidates and doing things like that that we can't do. Now, we're not doing it, but if we're partnered with them and our logos appear together, does that imply that we are now part of what they are doing and putting our tax-exempt status at risk?
That's a great question. So I think it kind of clarifies the importance of you all understanding what the rules are for 501c3 public charities, because anytime you collaborate and partner, which happens all the time in not only in nonprofit work in general, but also specifically in advocacy work, right? Because none of us can achieve any of these things on our own, and we have to work together to do that. So. So I would say one thing that's very clear and kind of just like a hot practical tip is that the IRS does hold you responsible for the content of your links online. They consider that something that you link to be part of your communication. And that's true whether it's your website linking to this partner organization, or whether it's a social media post on your organizational social media that links to some content. So, you know, if that link is a lobbying communication. Maybe it's a petition to the city council, please support such and so ordinance. Or, worst case is if it has some support or opposition to candidates, that will be attributed as part of your communication. So you do need to be careful about that. However, it does not mean that you can never collaborate in any way with groups that have a different tax status and that support and oppose candidates. Alliance for Justice has an affiliated 501c4 Alliance for Justice Action campaign, and many groups have that. That's one example, but even for folks who don't have that kind of affiliated organization, there may be unions, there may be C4s, or even political parties, or maybe even groups who have no tax status that you work with from time to time. You can only control what you can control. So if you're planning an event and you describe the event and maybe you have disclaimers at the event, especially if it's close in time to the election and maybe you're talking about issues that have a nexus to some of the endorsements that these groups are working on. Make it clear to your partners what the event is about, and that as a C3 you don't support or oppose candidates. Make it clear to the folks who attend that as a C3 you don't support or oppose candidates. I think you have to make a decision about whether it's appropriate to take on the risk of creating a forum for other people to express their views, which might include supporting and opposing candidates. That's something that like arts organizations will run up against, right? They'll be having a lot of kids, teaching them about civics and things like that, and they'll be creating art. And of course, some of those things are going to support and oppose candidates in some ways, right? And in that case, it's really kind of clear, like this is a forum, these are not our messages. We're just helping these kids learn about the process and express themselves through art. Great. I think that's perfectly understandable. If you're doing a forum about, a wedge issue in your local community that differentiates like two candidates for mayor, and everybody knows it, it's been covered a lot in the local press, and these partners have a table there, and at the table they're talking about their candidate endorsements. I don't know if that we're just creating a forum flies as much, right? Anything in this space about whether or not you're supporting or opposing a candidate for office is governed by what I call a facts and circumstance, or not just me, the IRS calls a facts and circumstances analysis. And so that means that they're going to look at all of, this is one of the graphics I like to use for that. They're going to look at all of the facts and context, and they're going to weigh it all together and decide whether they think you're supporting or opposing a candidate for office. And some of the key factors that they're going to look at were in this slide. So, when you're describing this event in the first place, are you talking about elections or voting? Because if you're doing that, then it makes it seem like you're putting yourself in the space. It doesn't mean you can't talk about elections and voting. You definitely can, but it raises the level of making sure that you're very even-handed in how you talk about the election, if that makes sense. They're going to look at things about what is your organization's core issues, and the track record your organization has in communicating about certain issues. They're going to look at the timing of this activity, right? Is this activity timed because of the election, or is this activity timed because of something else? even if it's close in time to the election, is it timed because of something else? And how they're going to look at who is kind of targeted audience for this event or communication. Are you going into some, legislative district that you've never worked in before? That would be a bad factor that would get weighed. But usually, as long as you're working with your traditional community or working with even underrepresented communities, including, Black communities, like race conscious, communities of color have been underrepresented in our political process, and so it's good news that we can continue to work specifically with those communities to help them participate in elections. But so those are some factors that would go into that analysis. I know that there's related questions. I also know that there was someone who had a question who had to leave soon, so I wanted to give that person a chance to ask a question if they are still here. I think it was Kate.
Well, Kate's question was, is doing advocacy on proposed legislation that is not a ballot measure yet or at the level of a legislative vote yet considered lobbying?
That's a good question. The definition of when something becomes lobbying, let me find a slide that could be a little framework for that. Has to do with, one of the factors has to do with specific legislation. And so from a legal standpoint, your question is it, when does it become specific legislation? Is it when, it gets introduced? It's actually a little bit before that. So for a ballot measure, it's going to vary because there's different ways that ballot measures get onto the ballot, right? So sometimes it's through the signature gathering process. Certainly the IRS says when petitions hit the streets, people start signing to support, that's a specific legislative proposal, right? It's written up, there's text, so that's specific. So if it's that kind of measure, that's when it will start to count. If it is something that's being placed on the ballot by a legislature, like a city council, county board, something like that, then you're kind of in the more traditional lobbying process ahead of that, right? Because there's a legislative vote to put it on the ballot. So certainly it would be before it gets put on the ballot. It would still count as lobbying if you're trying to influence that decision to place it on the ballot. The idea of specific legislation actually starts before something is introduced into the legislature, especially if you are trying to shop an idea for someone to introduce it, for example. So if you have, I have a slide of a picture of a kid who has a light bulb over his head. He has a bright idea, and once, if you have, I know that you all have bright ideas, and when they become specific, which is, again, squishy, that's why I have a job as a lawyer, that's when it should start to count. So especially if you're asking a legislator to introduce something and you have it written down on a few pages, that might be specific enough to be considered lobbying. So let's see, where should we go next? I wonder, well, I want to do a quick poll. Do you guys know how to use your reactions to put your hands up? Yes, Willie does. Okay, so let me make this full screen so I can see you all. I'm going to make this, why can I not see, oh, because I'm sharing my screen, I guess. Maybe Jenny Lynn can help me with this. How many of you have questions that are about whether or not something counts as lobbying and IRS rules for lobbying for 501c3s? Give me a show of hands with your...
I'm seeing some hands.
Okay, all right. How many of you... All right, I'll wait for those to clear off. How many of you have questions that are about, do I have to report something as a California ballot measure expenditure for a state or local ballot measure?
Less responses about that one, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how about questions about candidates or talking about issues in the context of the election right now? Questions about that?
Hands for that one.
Okay. All right. Let's start with something that's in that ballpark then, because we've talked a little bit about lobbying. Let's do a question about something election related, and let me look in the chat. Feel free to be typing stuff into chat. There's a question here from Michael that says, we're considering making a grant to organizations that at times endorses candidates. We've asked them not to use the money for endorsements or supporting candidates. How does the law treat that situation? That's great. If I'm assuming that this organization that you're making a grant to, if they endorse candidates, they're not a 501c3. And if you are a private foundation, there would be some pretty specific rules about grant making to a group that's not a 501c3. If you are a public charity making a grant to an organization that's not a 501c3, basically that's the main thing you need to do, is just make sure that you have a written agreement that asks them not to use your funds to support or oppose candidates for office, because they have to have the same rules for 501c3 funds that you do. So you couldn't pay them to do something that you can't do, obviously. And so, yeah, it sounds like you're doing it just right. We do have some sample grant agreements in some of our publications if you have some questions about that. I think that publication would be called Investing in Change.
Nona, just a quick reminder to slow down a little bit for interpreters.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you for the answer. That helps us. So what I understand, you need a written, it's nice to have something written in the grant agreement itself.
Yes. Yes. Write it down. Let's see. I'm scrolling back.
How much time do we have for this?
We still have another 20 minutes. So we can go real deep. Terry has a question here. Can you share more information on where we can figure out the percentage of time and resources we are allowed to spend on lobbying efforts?
Awesome. Yes, there is a resource in the resource drive called Public Charities Can Lobby, and that has the information, the specific information that you need to figure out what your lobbying limit would be. Essentially, there are two tests that the IRS allows most public charities to choose between for how we measure and report lobbying. The only kinds of public charities that do not have the ability to make a choice between these two tests are churches and houses of worship, what the IRS calls churches. Specifically those that are focused on worship and the actual church, not just faith-based organizations. Those organizations do not have a choice. All other public charities do have a choice, and for public charities who have a budget of less than $17 million, and even some who have higher budgets than that, but just maybe haven't been doing any lobbying at all and are looking to get started, there is a clear choice that is better in most situations. And although I cannot give you legal advice, it's usually a good idea to choose to use an expenditure test. And that's what I briefly referred to earlier. They call it the 501H election. And it doesn't mean that your tax status changes from being a 501c3 public charity or anything like that. It is just an expenditure test that allows you to have a lot more clarity about what counts as lobbying. So the definition that you see on my slide that's showing right now is really only applies if you're using the 501H expenditure test. Otherwise, it's really a much more basic, like, trying to influence legislation, even as the definition of lobbying. But really, one of the reasons why, the expenditure test allows you to do more lobbying. So small organizations budget up to $500,000 can spend 20% of their budget on lobbying under the expenditure test, whereas under the default test, they would only be able to spend 3 to 5%. That percentage goes down as a budget gets bigger, which is why I talked about budget size as a consideration. So you do have to take an affirmative step to choose this expenditure test, and that's one of the things that we really are always encouraging nonprofits to do, is to make the 501H election, fill out the actual easiest tax form known to humanity, which is 5768, and just check the box to choose to be under an expenditure test for your lobbying. Because if you don't do that and you still do lobby, there is a question on the 990, and it asks if you lobby. And under the default test, the IRS understands that volunteer lobbying that's done in the name of your organization counts as lobbying and should be reported. And I see this, people don't understand this. They think, oh, if I don't spend money on it, I don't have to report it. But that's not true. So if you have board members or you have community leaders who are at a meeting saying, I'm here with, this community nonprofit and I want you to, adopt this ordinance, that is reportable lobbying under the default test, but it's not reportable lobbying under this expenditure test. So a lot of good reasons to make that choice, and that publication will help. And if you have questions after reading that publication, please feel free to reach out to our hotline, and we're happy to walk you through it, including trying to figure out what test you're already using by looking at your 990 forms and things like that. So I wish it was simpler to answer that question, but I think that was a good introduction.
Nona, this is Dina. I was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on some of the relevant campaign work that you've seen where an organization has really had a high impact and worked within the constraints of what 501c3s are allowed to do. Maybe just a couple of examples that have stood out for you.
Sure. Let's see.
And to be fair, I just had to put Nona on the spot there, so thank you for for doing it.
No problem. I mean, there's so many examples, it's hard to choose, and I hate to leave people out. I can't even see on my screen very easily who all is with me. I'm sure there's people in the room who have great examples of work that they've done, so please excuse me if I don't lift up your example. You know, I'm hoping that Schools and Communities First will be a great example. It's on the ballot right now. It's Prop 15, and I know that the social justice movement and nonprofits and public foundations throughout the state have been working on this issue to fix California's budget for many, many years. And so I'm really excited about where that campaign is right now and what effective work has been done to take on something as challenging as property taxes. And I think it's such a great example of kind of the scale that Geoff mentioned as well, because it will contribute about $12 billion a year to the state's budget, which isn't something that philanthropy, you know, if philanthropy were to donate all of its money just to that, just to our state's budget to make sure that there's enough money for public education and community services in the state, it wouldn't come close to that amount. So, you know, it's something that I'm very excited about. You know, I think I've seen work on so many different issues. I've seen folks getting involved in commenting on federal policy and executive orders. I've seen folks getting involved in their city and county and state, but really their local budgets a lot to have a conversation about what, you know, how much of our public resources should be going to policing or to prisons versus all the other kinds of supports and services that people need and basic needs that people have. So, you know, I've seen people lift up their work through candidate forums, through educating local candidates for office, through, you know, candidate questionnaires and voter guides that are C3 appropriate, you know, not ranking any candidates, but giving very kind of even-handed information about how candidates have responded to certain questions. So all of those are things that the IRS has specifically blessed, you know, and said there's a 501c3 appropriate way to do this, and you know, there's so many kinds of activities that groups can do. You know, even the work to save the Affordable Care Act at the national level, nonprofits were very engaged in and getting, I think they played a strong role in helping individuals tell their stories about the importance of health care and the importance of having coverage for pre-existing conditions. So, you know, any kind of way that you want to slice it, any level of government, you know, nonprofits have been involved and can be involved in ways that are really impactful.
Thanks, Nona.
Great.
Does anyone have any other questions, or maybe even wanting to talk out potential scenarios or next steps that you're thinking about for this current election as well?
Well, I've already had one. So if no one else has one, I'll
Yes.
take a second.
Go ahead, Willie.
All right, Nona, so you were very precise about not being able to endorse anyone who is a candidate for office. That would include a currently elected official who's running for re-election or a unelected candidate who's running for election. What about an in-office candidate who is not running for election? So what about, hey, council member Nona is doing a great job, let's all come out and support her. Or council member Nona is doing a terrible job, let's all come out and oppose her, but she's not on the ballot. How does that fall into the equation?
That is a great question, and it's really the same analysis as I kind of mentioned for things like, you know, the advocacy that's happening close in time to the election for a particular candidate. Let's see if I think I even have some slides that are some examples down here. Yeah, okay, let me go through these. So we still have the right to support and oppose candidates, or not, sorry, I did that wrong. We still have the right to criticize our elected officials. That's what I was trying to say. It's almost my lunchtime, so please excuse me. You know, so that's something that we still have the right to do. And why did that go to the wrong slide? So I'll show you some examples. And it goes to this facts and circumstances test that the IRS is going to use to determine if any nonprofit has supported or opposed candidates for office. Here's an example from the National Immigration Law Center. That was a press release that they published in August 20th of 2019 about the public charge rule that the Trump administration changed to make it harder for folks to access benefits and to use that against them in immigration proceedings in certain ways. So this organization was one of the leaders of national leaders of organizing a campaign to get nonprofits and others to comment, to oppose the changes when they were coming out. None of that counted as lobbying because this was administrative advocacy, so it's not legislative, it's a regulation. But they were very involved with that. They generated, together with the national campaign that they co-led, they generated thousands and thousands, probably tens of thousands of comments opposing this regulatory change. And they also litigated against this change. That track record gives them a lot of leeway to talk about, to criticize the change once it comes into play. So you could see their statement that they made here, and this is the statement they made after the rule went into effect. And they're not criticizing the president personally or anything like that, but they're talking about the Trump administration's campaign or toolkit of fear that they're using to send a clear message to immigrants and people of color that you're not welcome here. Now, would this play differently if they said it now? Yes. But we kind of assume always that all of our leaders are up for re-election. So it's the way we talk about it. If we criticize or praise a policy, and the person is kind of incidentally part of that, and we do it at a time that's appropriate when that policy is being put into place, when it's, you know, in the news for, you know, non-election related reasons, that's going to be relatively low risk. But the timing is an important factor. The track record of your organization is an important factor. So I could also show a positive example of praising, you know, in this case, I think I've got, Holly Mitchell, and this is the Ella Baker Center, and they sponsored this bill, the state bill, and the day when it was signed by the governor, they tweeted about it. They thanked Senator Holly Mitchell for her leadership. Now, she's up for election on November 3rd. Again, hopefully we're all actually voting early and encouraging other people to vote early, so I don't like saying November 3rd, but she's up for re-election right now. And, but they're not saying that you should vote for Holly Mitchell. They're not talking about the election. They're talking about the policy that they've worked on, that they helped to introduce, and talking about the issue. This is a step towards relieving burden of debt from women of color. So those are some of the criteria that are going to be looked at when people are criticizing or praising elected officials.
So that's a great help. Really helps clarify. It still kind of bleeds back into my first question, which is, let's say there was a rally to celebrate the passage of this law, and this organization, Ella Baker, was there along with her Reelect Holly campaign at this rally. They can be there as long as they keep sort of like a dividing line between the specific partisan activities by one group and themselves, right?
I am not sure. So again, two things. This is a facts and circumstances analysis. It's every situation is going to be different. No lawyer, even one who's representing you and writing you a legal opinion, can tell you absolutely this is allowed or absolutely this is not allowed. So it's just how it looks with all of the factors. And some of the factors, you remember also that I gave this example up here of this Bernie rally, right? So we did not want to be, even though we're allowed to be saying yes on 61, we're not allowed to be featuring Bernie saying yes on 61 when Bernie is up for re-election. So I would give your scenario, which is an event that has a C3 appropriate purpose, is policy related, would be pretty similar to this in my view. It would be pretty high on the risk spectrum if the campaign was there and they were having campaign-related messages at this event. Now, if Senator Mitchell was there in her role as a senator and she was talking about how great she was for all the work that she did on this, that would actually be fine as long as she doesn't talk about the election or ask people to vote for her and or ask for money or anything like that. If you're going to invite someone who is also a candidate for office to one of your events in another role, maybe they're an elected official, maybe they're a business leader, maybe they're a nonprofit leader, you can have them there to talk about that other role. It does become a little bit higher risk very close in time to the election, especially if you don't have another reason for the timing of your event. But you know, I would definitely recommend using clarifying ahead of time in writing with the person that they do not mention the election or their candidacy, and so that you have that in writing ahead of time. You can clarify to anyone who has a question about what your intent was, and so that's something that you can do. You can also, I would also encourage you to work with the person's official public staff rather than their campaign staff. Working with campaign staff on an event is probably not a good thing for a C3 to be doing.
Thank you so much, Nona. And welcome, everyone. You got to see the last little bit of our, our breakout session. So I wanted to check in. How did your conversations go? Would anyone like to share out a couple key takeaways or even any like fiery next steps that you may feel from your conversation? Any brave souls, or possibly even the breakout session leaders. Oh, I see, Erica.
Hi, I was elected to report out. I can't say that we have any fiery next steps, but we kind of just covered some basics, actually. We were a small group of 4, so it was really intimate, and some of the things that I found really helpful was just the fact that the benefit of having a really highly technical definition of lobbying. The benefit of that is that it sets the bar really high. So we talked about the difference.
Oh, quick reminder, Erica, just to slow down a little bit for our interviewers. No worries. It's exciting information to share. I understand.
And I talk quickly, so thank you. So we talked about the difference between direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying, and then we talked about how in California, if you are going to be endorsing or supporting or opposing a ballot measure, you're actually not doing, let's see, which way are we doing it here? You're not doing grassroots lobbying because you're not speaking to a legislative body. So you're speaking to the people. And ultimately that this was important because grassroots lobbying is more strict under the IRS. So direct lobbying, you might have a limit of 20% of your total organization's expenditures, but only a quarter of it can be grassroots lobbying. So we just talked about that distinction. We talked about the intricacies of seeking board level approval or not if you're going to engage in these types of political, this type of political work. And we also talked about the things that might come up if you are having elected leaders come to your fundraising events and what the limits would be there and things to look out for. So those are just some of the topics that we covered.
Thank you so much, Erica, for sharing that out. Does anyone else want to contribute?
Erica, I think you just got offered a job with Bolder Advocacy.
Michael, seems like, are you trying to share out?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I found it very interesting, and it very clarifying in terms of, where we can lobby, how to a couple measures on how much lobbying we can do and how to report to the IRS. So it was very helpful. And the overall message is, yes, you can do it. Just be careful how to do it, which I think is a good message.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate having all of you here engaging in that in this really important conversation. And honestly, just staying vigilant too. I think that's a really important thing to remember for ourselves. So I'm going to hand it over to, Gary, go ahead.
I just wanted to report out on our group. I think it's a lot easier when you have a defined process internally to deal with, making these decisions. And it makes everybody feel a lot more comfortable, including board members, executive directors, donors, et cetera, if you have a really defined process. So I just want to report out that it was really great, the resources that Stanley offered in our breakout. to help folks really kind of put this down on paper so that people understand that there can be a process that people can follow.
Yeah, exactly. And I would just also add, I know the example of the fact that you can host candidate forums is something that we didn't get to dive into a lot, but that's one more way that that organizations can engage in elections as well. So I wanted to just close by saying thank you so much. I hope that this has been a helpful and hopefully inspiring introduction on a topic that's certainly vast, but it's so vitally important to our work. Again, I'd like to thank everyone who's responsible for co-creating this workshop. We have our wonderful interpreters, Carla and Lena. Thank you for bearing with us as we talked very loudly, or not very quickly rather. My very thoughtful co-hosts, Jenilyn and Dina at Cal Lutheran Center for Nonprofit Leadership. And we have our really insightful speakers, Geoff and Nona. Thanks for sharing your expertise and time. And last, but certainly not least, thanks to each and every one of you for attending today, for taking the time and energy to learn more on this topic. And for those of you that are working to create communities that are healthy, that are just, thank you for your work more broadly. I encourage you to stay in touch. Don't hesitate to contact me, the fund, the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, Bolder Advocacy, if we can be helpful at all in your work. And again, I've put in our chat our resource guide, which we'll email out to you as well, and just a list of handouts that were mentioned today and websites that we referenced. So with that, I'm gonna close and wishing you all to stay safe, be well, and thanks so much for your work. Take care, everybody.